Thank you very much. I'm really happy to present at this workshop. I'm impressed by the huge participation by the Japanese industry. Actually, it shows that in Japan, climate change is now really gaining traction. And of course, I'm happy to contribute international experience. Before starting, just a few words about my company Perspectives. So Perspectives, as said, is having the dual characteristics of a think tank, working on the forefront of the international carbon market design, but also supporting private sector players in finding their way through the intricacies of the carbon market. For example, in the context of clean development mechanism, we've supported many programs of activities in Africa and other regions. So, of course, if Japanese industry is looking for support in navigating the way through the carbon market, we are at your disposal. So we have published last year in December an overview of the landscape of Article 6 piloting, which is available for anyone to download. And it provides an overview of who in the world has been engaged in Article 6 to date. Here I would like to start with a global world map of Article 6 pilots. So you see Article 6 piloting is quite widespread. It has 3 regional focus points. One, of course, is Southeast Asia, and that's a region which has traditionally been very active also in context of the Japanese initiatives. Of course, Indonesia, for example, as leading country under joint crediting mechanism, but also other countries like Thailand, Vietnam. Then we have a surprisingly strong showing of Africa. Africa in the past was not really integrated in the international carbon markets. Under clean development mechanism, it came much later than other regions, but now under Article 6, it's really playing a strong role. You see a cluster in East Africa. You also see a cluster in Francophone West Africa. So this, of course, is a new trend, and it will be interesting to see how then the activities emerge specifically. And then we have the Pacific Rim of Latin America, which is strongly represented. And of course, Juan Pedro will tell you about the Chilean experiences. You see here the different colors, and that show the different initiatives, and one sees that it's quite diverse already. So we have, of course, joint crediting mechanism where Kazu gave you the clear picture. It's by far the largest initiative, both in terms of funding, but also in depth. Now more than a decade of experience has accumulated. So of course it is a very important blueprint for the collaboration under Article 6.2, so the bilateral collaboration between countries. Then you see the yellow dots, which is the CLIC Foundation. So Michael Brennwald is with us. The CLIC Foundation, of course, is a very interesting public-private partnership in Switzerland, and I think you'll learn a lot from their approaches. Also, one of the very few approaches that is already concretely doing action on the ground. And then we have various other activities. For example, we have the German Ministry of Environment. We have Chile and Canada collaborating with the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development in the Mediterranean region. We have the Nordic Environmental Finance Corporation. Actually, the Nordic countries, Scandinavia, they are getting quite active now in Article 6 piloting. So, for example, you see the red dots, the Swedish Energy Agency. Also, of course, we need to be clear that there are various forms of collaboration, and we have now developed what we would like to call the concentric ring model of the Article 6 piloting. So if you look at these rings, the innermost circle, these are activities that focus on actually generating emission credits or internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, or also adaptation benefits, because there's also the Article 6.8, the non-market mechanisms, where we see the first activities emerging. And I think many of those who will speak to you today are coming from the innermost circle. It's clear JCM, CLIC, and also the Chilean program, they all belong to that. Then we have the second circle, which looks into activities that eventually will be subject to Article 6 rules, but that were set up in the sense of fulfilling national level climate policy targets. For example, emission trading schemes, they are starting to be linked across countries. We've seen such linkages in North America between California and Quebec. We've seen linkage, for example, between Switzerland and the European Union. So these linkages are gaining ground. And then we have the outermost circle, which also, of course, will be discussed today, where there's a number of international institutions that want to support the development of Article 6 piloting, but that are not interested in the credits themselves. So it has already been mentioned, the ADB fund that supports the JCM, or we have the World Bank. Chandra will talk about various initiatives in the World Bank. So it is very important, of course, for you to understand in which of those circles the respective initiative is located, because that will lead to very different forms of design. If we now look into the scale of the initiative, because under Article 6 and the Paris Agreement, we want to see an upscaling of international carbon markets, we still see a relatively large share of initiatives that continue in the similar vein as we saw under CDM. So we look at specific projects or programs of activities, but it's always about distinct activities. So this is the case under the JCM, also under the Swiss programs. Then we have some initiatives that look into sectoral approaches, for example, in the context of the Canadian-Chile program, it's looking at the waste sector. And we also have various of the Scandinavian programs that go that size. And then, of course, we have the policy scale approaches, where probably the World Bank's transformative carbon asset facility is the most important aspect. On the right-hand side, you see the financial volumes. Of course, not all these programs have their full budgets unveiled to date, but it is clear that JCM is by far having the largest budget, followed by the Swiss activities under CLIC, where, of course, the budgets will come over time, but there is a clear indication about the order of magnitude. And then we have, of course, the World Bank with their transformative carbon asset facility. All in all, we have a bit more than $1 billion budgeted, but this, of course, will change quite quickly. With regard to the technology focus, you've heard about JCM being very broad. Other activities are a bit less broad. Also, the scale of the activities, of course, depend on the sector. So you see that most of the activities look into energy supply demand. There is also quite a significant focus on the waste sector. There has now been, over the past couple of years, accumulation of experience. One can say that, of course, due to the delay in getting the Article 6 rules on the international level, and also the pandemic, the pace of development has slowed down a bit. We are looking forward to this picking up this year. There are already some tendencies. For example, in the last quarter of 2020, there were 2 bilateral agreements between Switzerland and Peru and Ghana, respectively. What we see is that the host countries, compared to the situation that we had under the Clean Development Mechanism, are a bit more reluctant to engage. That's of course clear because host countries have much more responsibility now than they had under the Kyoto Protocol, where the host country approval of an activity didn't actually generate any liability. But now, of course, with the likelihood of the host country having to deduct the volume of emission credits exported through so-called corresponding adjustment, it is much more important for the host country to understand what it actually means for its balance of emission. And therefore, for example, the Peruvian-Swiss negotiation took 3 years. Now, of course, the successor agreements between Switzerland and other countries, they go faster. But of course, it means one needs patience and time. What one can also say, of course, we see the classical barriers of international carbon market action, how to determine additionality, how to ensure the upfront funding of the activities. But overall, we don't see a real deal breaker there. What one needs to say is that in terms of the baseline setting, we see emergence of new approaches, for example, a transformative carbon asset facility, policy level baseline setting is being tested. We see the sectoral crediting framework, also mobilized by the World Bank, which tries to reduce the transaction cost and use of default parameters. Under JCM, we have a similar approach, also using a lot of defaults. So there is good learning, and the diversity of the programs, of course, accelerates this learning. Of course, all this is playing in the shadow of the uncertainty of the international negotiations. And we don't see, and we hope, of course, that COP26 will come up with a rule set eventually. But of course, a successful completion of these negotiations would be crucial to really mobilize an upscaling of Article 6 activities. So with that, I would like to thank you and point you towards the report. Of course, I'm happy to take up any questions also bilaterally that you may have. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions.